Hey everybody, welcome to Porchside Chats with the Prof, I guess. I don't know. Just want to follow on an idea of how to get past that bad moment when the prof comes to you or says in red ink, not enough analysis, or even worse, they just never come out and say that your ideas did anything. I remember writing a short story that I got Best Short Story Award for, and then going to a short story writer, her looking at it, by the way, a prop, saying, "Oh, you want an award for that?" It's like, oh, okay. So what do we do to find a moment, right? We don't want to take every prop as saying they're God. Obviously, in this case, I think it was a pretty good story, just saying. But there are often moments when we don't have a good thesis. We don't have enough, so to speak. I mean, how about the time when I have students come up to me and say, "Hey, what's the word count again?" Which is another way of saying, I don't know if I have enough to say or how I'm going to get to what I need to get to. Let's talk about the building block of an essay and really how to get to the heart of what an essay was meant to be. And Montaigne invented this genre way, way back, I believe late 1600s, when he wanted to, quote, test an idea. That's what the word essay in the French means. I believe it's essai. It's the idea of to test, to judge, to examine. And it's a way of thinking it out in a letter format, which he wrote to friends to think through ideas. And so when we do a critical summary, it gets us there. What is a critical summary? It is a building block in an essay where we not only summarize, but we add inflection. We have a critical dimension of our own insight that's entering and interpreting the text in a way, of course, that livens things up. It's, if you will, a good thesis drawn out. It is just one chunk, doesn't have to be the whole essay, it doesn't have to be predominant. Most times this happens in a matter of 2 paragraphs within an essay and a larger project, if you will, the essay being 5-10 pages. But let's talk about this chunk, if you will. In any order, we have to cover these elements. Those of you in my classes all have this, the genre and title of the reading. Hey, look, if I'm reading Samantha Schwelman, hailed as one of the best writers under the age of 30 in Spanish. If I'm looking at her work, if I don't label the genre as magical realism, I'm not letting people get to what she's about. In other words, she's got these surreal, bizarre situations when you're walking down the road, so to speak, and you're like, okay, I guess the road is shifting. Something strange is happening. Sort of that mind-bending moment. So having that genre in some cases critical, in other cases, not a big deal. Just call it a short story, we're good. Title of reading, of course, author's name, of course, but often their role, if they have a function, or we again want to prop up our sources. If we can slightly give them a sense of worthy status, it gives our paper a sense of worthy. So if we say best-selling author or number 7 on the New York Times best-selling list, that helps out. Author's motivations for their argument. I think a lot of times we forget this, and this is the larger conversation that we get from Gerald Graff's work in They Say, I Say, and his argument, best-selling work, as we know, among academic texts, I think sold over now 4 or 5 million. And his basic thought is that if we don't have an argument, don't have a sense of where the author's coming from, who they're reaching, and why they're writing this text, then we're not really there. That most authors have a project they're writing toward. They're not writing from a thesis where they just plonk it down on the first page and say, okay, let's trot it through. They're really saying, here are 2 or 3 ideas I have in the constellation of my mind. And usually by page 2 or 3, we start seeing a tighter ring, if you will, centrifugal force between those 3 ideas playing through and allowing us to understand the purpose and maybe arrive at a quasi-thesis or main point. But it's more so working through that and often finding their motivations. This goes somewhat toward this point too, because I use the word purpose and motivation somewhat interchangeably. They're not necessarily the same thing. Purpose being, of course, the goal of a text to get to a point and reach a particular audience. The motivations perhaps being more the intention and the mood and the sensibility which drove the piece initially. Maybe the larger sort of nagging sense of persons wanting to kind of work through. The brief who, what, where, when, why, the beginning, middle, and end of a text in summary is critical. Otherwise, we don't have the word summary. Key thing here is not to be incomplete. Sometimes we think we covered a text when we didn't, and sometimes it's more important to cover it, and sometimes it's less. If we're covering a piece for the sake of a person understanding what they're getting into, they're probably going to want this fairly complete. Most professors, for example, in history work, would like to have a complete sense that you've really grasped the sense of the text accurately. Um, there are cases, though, even there are exceptions. If we look at A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and we were trying to summarize just the first chapter, which many of us might be doing, there's really only 2 points in that chapter. A, Columbus abused Native Americans radically, and B, why don't we know about this? What is it about our education system that's not allowing a more balanced, full view of this teaching? All right, more quickly now, the main part of a critical summary, as well as hopefully an essay in general, is to test and probe and examine your own thoughts. I like to use the word explore here, exploring the point you thought was intriguing and letting us know how and why, constantly letting us sense that your voice is coming through, that you're flexing your opinion using evidence, sure, because you've established an ethos now. Most times this comes toward the end, but we'll talk about that. But you've established an ethos of authority, knowing the text, knowing the accuracy, and giving us information, helping and feel up to date, feeling fully equipped to entertain your thoughts. And let's explore, because that's the heart of it. Now, a lot of the other elements, at times you can kind of bulk them, meaning you can kind of say, don't need to do as much there. But this one, we definitely want to give ourselves time to do it. So let's talk about how to develop those focal points of interest in the summary, working the passage that you thought was intriguing, but not necessarily easy to understand at first glance, and pushing yourself, especially to paraphrase it completely and then puzzle it out. Now, many times this action of paraphrasing or working the text happens, so to speak, with your pen in the margins. It's more of your thinking before you get to the final draft stage. But sometimes it can be helpful, and most times it can be helpful in a text to actually have a phrase by phrase paraphrase of the text. The phrase, in other words, is a classic move, and we should have got that usually in high school when we think of most paragraph structures. Most paragraphs have a combination of these, usually in this order. You have the topic sentence, a reinforcement sentence that, if you will, narrows the scope slightly, an illustration sentence of the claim or point that you're already starting to establish, and that illustration often being a quote, and then coming out of that illustration or quote with a summary. In other words, or what Smith seems to be saying, those pull phrases after a quote are so important because they establish a sense of, okay, why are we looking at this, or what does it mean, or help me hear it again. And that's such a great thing to do. And then pushing finally into what we call the analysis, or in a triac model, topic, reinforcement, illustration, analysis, conclusion model of a paragraph. Does that have to be every paragraph? Oh God, I hope not, please. But are those elements there? And do we want to have a robust sense of a good paraphrase? Yes. In this case, you've got 2 paragraphs for most critical summaries, and so it may not be as complete, but at least having a paraphrase in your mind of what that means is good, and it possibly would make the page here nonetheless. The main point in this here is to puzzle. The second we've often gone over in class. I'm not going to be overworking this, because some of us would say, okay, been here. Gaps again, something's missing. Repetitions, something's repeating. Why? Significance, or perhaps redundancy on the author's part. Anomaly is something weird, strange, doesn't seem to fit. Often it happens in between paragraphs where there's a drop point, where there's not sense of transition. And binaries being the most important perhaps for this particular project. Binaries establish tension, which establish interest, because we're trying to see who wins. Which idea seems more prevalent? Why is there tension? All those things crop in our minds as soon as we see a binary. A binary is a presumed opposition between ideas, characters, or groups that is really promising for us to get material to interpret. Challenge yourself always to find more than one interpretation of a passage you examine. One means could be using the rhetorical frame of appearance versus reality. Rhetoric is the art or communication of strategies to persuade. And this particular trope goes back to Aristotle, appearance versus reality. You think it's this, but in reality, it's this, or we're flipping assumptions. It's a good idea to use these anywhere. You can use them in your thesis statement beginning or in your analysis of a text. Another way to do it is constantly ask how so to try to understand a process better. One way to do that might be with again with the text of Howard Zinn. Let's take Columbus. How does he abuse them? How so? Well, that's easy, but how so? Maybe how so? How does he enact a mentality of colonialism? Oh, well, he abuses them, right? But he also has this dialogue going on with the Queen in his letters, which says, I'm going to get you the gold. And oh, by the way, these people are very nice, so nice that we can kind of get what we want. And then we go for one more how so? Well, how so? Because we're doing a trade here. We're bringing the gospel of good news and, of course, your conquest and your authority over these lands. And maybe there's the complication. Maybe that's where the depth of the analysis comes in, because maybe he's also duped by his own sensibility, his own ideas of his religion. And that's where we want to get complication. And that often asking how so more than once, or thinking more about multiple elements in that case that contribute to Columbus's motivations could be helpful. Another word that is often twin here with with how so is why. Why gets us more at purpose and perhaps at meaning, at motivations. Asking why a person does what they do. In this case with Columbus, we not only might have ramifications of multiple ways that he's enacting colonial thought, but the why here might be interesting. Why is he doing this? Well, he's looking for power. He's looking for money. That's pretty obvious. But maybe the next why might be, what is it about? Why is he using religion to get to his power? Well, it's the means, of course, of rationalizing one's ability to do whatever they do, perhaps. And then we might ask another why. So why is it within this sphere that religion seems to get so co-opted, and are there exceptions? And indeed there are, as the chapter itself shows, the Catholic priests saying, what is going on? And being horrified by the treatment of natives, even as they're kind of caught in this tidal wave with Columbus on the island. So ways to ask those questions over and over. Okay, we're going to run through 2 slides of how to start. These are all important. A firecracker insight is a way to start not only an essay, but also a portion of a critical summary, which could be, again, further into an essay. An example, in historian Rebecca Larson's provocative book, Daughters of Light, one realizes a root of the American psyche right away. The Puritan emphasis on original sin versus the Quaker emphasis on inner light. So here we've got all kinds of layouts, meaning that immediately out of this phrase, we can tease out points. First of all, we define the American psyche. What do we mean by that? Secondly, we define the Puritan emphasis on original sin and its implications. And then thirdly, we define the Quaker emphasis on inner light and its implications. These can interpolate, they can kind of work alongside each other. They don't have to be in sequence, but nonetheless, these kind of insight starters trigger the explication. They almost lay out, much like a forecasting thesis, where you're going to go. Another one that's similar, more thematic here, is to start with a title, author, role, genre, and hit the overall theme, which you then are going to pull on, rather than a point of a piece. In this case, Spokane tribal member and award-winning author Sherman Alexie plunges his readers into the grim but plucky dynamic of 20-something tribal members negotiating their identities and futures in the 1990s. His 1993 collection of short stories, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven, was written by him at the early age of 27 and was hailed by the New York Times for its showcase of its striking lyric power to both, quote, lament and praise Native Americans. It's a larger theme, and it's more of a thematic attached in this case to the author. And that can be one way to work it to get us into a text. Another is a problem in need of a solution. If we can establish a problem, we bait the readers to read onward, knowing that you should be delivering a solution. An example here would be, and forgive me for not having the quote marks, why is it that close to 40 years after the publication of A History of the United States, that high school students in America still aren't often taught the abuse of Native peoples by Christopher Columbus? All right, a few more. An umbrella lead. This is a lead that introduces several equal or almost equal elements of a story. The example here is that 3 groups emerge as centrifugal forces in Samantha Schweblin's surreal, gothic-tinged short story, Headlights. The faceless, silent driving men, the traumatized, vile, backstabbing women, and the women who stomp on the gas pedal and declare that they have had enough with waiting. Lots to unpack there, right? It allows you to just kind of pull out each of those points. Maybe we even take a good portion to establish each of those layers. Maybe we start with, if you will, those driving men that are referenced more so at the beginning and the end of the text, but always are sort of the haunting element by which the binary is established. Reveal a scene or character quality and bait one to explore it as key. The example here is Nene, who's the key character, of course, and here we go. Nene, the key protagonist in Samantha Schweblin's short story Headlights, never exhales a cigarette, I should say, until the end of the story, right? An interesting moment because that's telling and it allows us to grip into what that whole action symbolizes. We can create an imaginary dialogue between two key authors. And an example of that as a lead or a way to start either the essay or a series of paragraphs would be if fiction writer Samantha Schweblin and historian Rebecca Larson ever had a chat. It would likely be, what happened to the Quaker women preachers of the early 1700s? And lastly, we can explore motives for the author's arguments. Again, whenever we can take the text or a theme and then set it into a larger shrift of what's going on in society at the time and or its implications for now, we're making a larger move of humanities. They're making a larger move of saying, why are we here? What are we doing? And how are we going to enact a better society? And that's worthy, I think, always. The example here is in her short story, Headlights, Samantha Schweblin seems bent on challenging the notion of gender and heterosexual loyalty. I hope these particular illustrations are helpful. Each of these techniques are ways to start. I'll talk more about ways to develop and push off of a insight that you've established. We'll talk a little bit more about pushing the why and how so as we look at some samples, especially in class. And hopefully this was helpful enough to y'all. See if I can get back out. Here we go. Good to chat with y'all. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Hope this was helpful.